Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really big question, one that sort of shapes our entire world. The connection between economic disparity and, well, our political attitudes.
Exactly. We're going to be diving into a whole stack of source material that tracks the long, winding story of global income inequality.
And we're looking for how these huge financial shifts actually, rewire political movements and public opinion.
And our mission today is pretty specific. We're targeting a core assumption a lot of people have, and maybe you, the listener, have it too.
Just what?
It's the idea that as inequality gets worse, people just automatically swing towards, say, social democratic or left-leaning politics.
Right, that it's a simple cause and effect.
It is. And we're here to show you, using historical data and some hard numbers, that the political fallout is, well, it's a lot more volatile, more contradictory, and just way more complex than that.
Okay, so let's unpack this history. We've been looking at a ton of global data, mostly from the World Inequality Database, we'll probably call it the WID, and also key reports from places like Brookings.
And what this long view, this century-long view shows us is that the story since 1900 it's not a straight line at all.
Not at all. It really breaks down into these three huge phases. You've got the high global disparity of the early 20th century, then this surprising period of mid-century compression, and then finally the modern era, the return to these huge internal gaps, but at the same time, this weird global convergence.
And to even begin to navigate those phases without getting lost, we have to clarify something right up front, a framework.
Okay.
We absolutely have to distinguish between two types of inequality. First, you've got within-country inequality. That's the gap inside a single nation.
So the difference between a banker in New York and, say, a farmer in Alabama.
Exactly. And then second, there's between country inequality. That's the huge gap separating rich nations from poor nations.
Like the average income in Germany versus the average income in Nigeria.
Precisely. And the political consequences of those two gaps are just fundamentally different.
That definitely makes the task clearer. You can't just treat the whole world as one big economic bucket. So, okay, let's jump into that first phase, the long arc, from 1900 to about 1980.
Right. And this period starts with a staggering divergence. The data shows global inequality more than doubled in less than a century.
Wow, doubled.
Yeah, between around 1820 and, say, 1910, it was a completely unprecedented explosion of global wealth concentration.
That's just a monumental rise. So what was the engine behind that? I mean, how did economists even track a shift that big 100 years ago?
Well, the primary engine was overwhelmingly between country inequality. This was that moment in history when the industrialized West—
Fueled by colonization and technology.
Exactly, just pulled away from the rest of the world at this incredible speed. If you look at the Gini coefficient—
Our standard measure for inequality, right?
where 0 is perfect equality and 1 is total monopoly. The global estimates back then were really high. Even with limited data, our sources show that for the countries we have data for, the global Gini was already around 0.40 in 1900.
Can you give us some context on that number? What does a 0.40 Gini actually feel like in the real world?
Well, inside a single country, 0.40 is considered high, but not, completely extreme.
Okay.
But in a global context, back in the early 1900s, that number meant a radical centralization of wealth in just a handful of nations. It meant most of the world's population was stuck at the bottom.
A foundational economic split, really.
It absolutely defined global politics for decades.
Okay, but this is where it gets really counterintuitive, because even while that global gap between countries was widening, if we zoom in on the mid-century, say 1910 to 1980, the WID data shows that within country inequality, the gaps inside those rich nations actually went down on average.
Exactly. This is the dual reality you have to hold in your head. Domestic gaps were narrowing in many Western nations, but the gap between the rich world and the poor world kept growing right up until about 1980.
That must have created some incredible friction.
Intense friction, both on the streets of Europe and across the rest of the globe.
So if the numbers were that stark, how did that manifest politically in the early years, that huge gap between nations?
Globally, it was pure fuel for anti-colonial and nationalist movements. For non-Western nations, seeing their relative poverty against the, opulence of the imperial powers, they saw it as fundamentally unjust.
So they weren't fighting for socialism in the Western sense.
Not at all. They were fighting for national economic self-determination.
And then domestically, in places like the US or the UK, the massive internal gaps from the Gilded Age fueled a totally different kind of tension.
Oh, absolutely. That high internal inequality was the critical breeding ground for major working-class movements. You saw the rise of socialist parties, powerful labor unions, communist organizations,
All demanding radical redistribution.
and this led to this fierce ideological fight, with the economic elite spending huge amounts of money to defend the very unequal system that was in place.
Let's focus on the period after the World Wars, though, because that's where the within-country compression really starts to accelerate.
Right.
That decline in internal inequality from the 10s to the 80s, it coincided with one of the biggest political shifts in history, the rise of the welfare state.
And what's fascinating is how the political system pivoted. After the chaos of the Great Depression and the wars, there was this profound shift in political consensus, especially in the West.
It became a widely shared belief, you're saying.
Yes, often across the traditional left-right divide. The government was now seen as having an active, a necessary role in reducing domestic inequality.
So we're not just talking about a higher minimum wage. This was a fundamental restructuring.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about things like highly progressive tax regimes. In the U.S. and the U.K., the top marginal tax rates for the super wealthy could be, between 70 and 90% in those post-war decades.
That's a massive tool for redistribution.
A huge mechanism. And we also saw the creation of universal social safety nets, national health services, huge expansions in public education, social security programs. The sources are clear that these changes were incredibly effective at compressing the income distribution inside those nations.
So it sounds like for about 70 years, political institutions actually managed to contain that internal disparity, and it led to a kind of political stability. But what happened? I mean, if that consensus was so successful, why did it collapse and lead us into the divergence we see today?
That really is the million-dollar question. I think the political foundation of that mixed economy was maybe weaker than we remember it.
How so?
You had a perfect storm of factors. The rise of neoliberal economic ideas, the oil shocks of the 1970s, increasing global competition. All of it gave political actors a chance to challenge that post-war consensus.
And the system of high taxes and regulation got the blame for the economy slowing down.
Exactly. Which brings us right to what we call the Great Reversal, starting around 1980.
The Great Reversal. This is our world now. And it's defined by these two simultaneous, almost contradictory economic trends. Can you just outline those for us again?
Sure. Since about 1980, the trend completely reversed. Within-country inequality has surged again, often back to 1920s levels, especially in rich countries.
Okay.
But at the exact same time, between-country inequality has started to decline meaningfully for the first time in basically 2 centuries.
So the rich are pulling away from the poor inside our own countries, while poorer countries are catching up to richer ones on a global scale.
That's it.
That sounds like a recipe for some serious political friction, especially in the West. Let's talk about the global convergence part first.
It's a monumental shift, and it's driven almost entirely by the rapid, sustained growth of huge economies that used to be poor. We're talking mainly about China and India.
And that has totally redrawn the global income map.
It has. The WID data shows the global JNE, which peaked around 0.72 back in 2000, fell to about 0.67 by 2020. In global terms, that is a huge drop in disparity.
You used a technical term earlier, the shift to a unimodal distribution. Can you explain that in, practical terms for the listener?
Yeah, absolutely. So think of the global income distribution before 1980, like 2 separate mountain ranges. You had the high peaks of the rich West, and then way, way over here, the low, flat plains of the developing world.
With a huge empty valley in between.
Exactly. A unimodal distribution just means that valley is now being filled in.
Yeah.
The world's population isn't just clustered in 2 buckets anymore. It's spreading out more like one continuous, if still pretty lopsided, hill.
And the human impact of that is just enormous. The data shows the global median annual income nearly doubled in just 1 decade, from 2003 to 2013.
Billions of people lifted out of what we used to call the global poor. It's historic, but, and this is a huge but, this very convergence has created deep structural stress in developed nations.
How?
The average person in the U.S. or Europe sees their national economy losing ground relative to China, while at the same time they're watching the gap inside their own country get dramatically wider.
That combination, it creates this deep sense of being left behind.
It's a profound feeling of being left behind.
And this is what fuels the populist backlash that we see everywhere now. And here's where we challenge that initial idea we started with. Rising inequality doesn't just push people left.
No. The surge in internal inequality fuels a bipartisan populism.
Right.
The economic stress is the same for everyone, stagnant wages, insecure jobs, but the political reaction channels that anger in two very different directions.
So you get left-wing populism, which is anti-corporate, anti-elite, blaming Wall Street and globalization.
Right. And on the other side, you get right-wing populism that channels that exact same economic anxiety into being anti-globalization, anti-immigration, and focused on, cultural elites.
But the common thread for both is this feeling that the traditional institutions, government, media, political powers have failed them.
And are actively serving the wealthy elite, which raises a critical consequence. What happens when people feel betrayed by their own institutions?
Trust just collapses.
It does. The source data shows a clear correlation between this surge in internal inequality and declining public trust in everything. Governments, parties, even science and media.
Yeah.
If you believe the system is rigged for the top 1%, why would you trust it?
And that erosion of trust just pours gasoline on political polarization. If the system has legitimacy, people will debate tax brackets.
But if they think the whole system is fundamentally broken, they won't want moderate reform. They'll demand radical structural change.
This brings us to a really crucial finding you mentioned, the Great Gatsby curve.
Yes, and this isn't just some academic term. It's an empirical observation. It shows that countries with higher income inequality tend to have significantly lower intergenerational social mobility.
That's a powerful visual. High inequality basically acts like a concrete ceiling for the next generation. It makes it harder to climb out of wherever you started.
Exactly. And the political consequence of that for you, the listener, is fundamental. This correlation shatters that core democratic belief that hard work pays off.
It becomes a myth.
It becomes a myth. We know from the data it's much harder for a kid born into a high inequality society to surpass their parents' income. And if people genuinely believe their own children can't get ahead, they become far more likely to demand radical change. The system has lost its basic promise.
So if that internal disparity is the key driver of our politics today, what does this analysis suggest for the future, for the risks and opportunities?
Well, the primary risk is the entrenchment of populism. If this high within-country inequality just continues, and especially if that positive global convergence trend slows down, it provides constant oxygen for populist movements on both the left and the right.
They stop being temporary reactions and just become permanent fixtures of the political landscape.
Which creates chronic instability.
But surely the awareness of this inequality also presents an opportunity. When the gaps get this obvious, it has to create pressure for big structural change.
It does. Absolutely. We're seeing more demand for major redistributive policies now than at any point since the 1970s. The source material points to serious consideration of things like wealth taxes or much stronger social policies.
Or even global reforms you mentioned. What would that even look like?
We're talking about international efforts. Things like a coordinated global minimum tax on capital or on multinational corporations.
Because the super wealthy can just move their money across borders to avoid taxes.
Precisely. So the only way to really tackle that kind of disparity is through coordinated global action.
And what about that institutional trust deficit? That sense that the whole system is rigged, that has to be a pressure point too.
It is. The extreme erosion of trust could actually force deep, necessary reforms in our democratic systems, in our economies, in our tax codes. That's the positive feedback loop. When the public sees the inequality as not just large, but persistent and unfair, it forces the system to adapt or risk losing its democratic legitimacy completely.
So this has been a really fascinating trip through a century of economics and politics. We started with this simple idea, inequality equals leftism, and we end up with something so much more complex.
I think the key takeaway is that the political reaction really depends on where the disparity is. If the gap is internal, between neighbors, it generates this bipartisan populist pressure.
And if the gap is external, between nations, it fuels nationalism and anti-colonialism.
Exactly. And the consequence of the rising internal inequality since 1980 isn't a simple left turn. It's the growth of these powerful, skeptical movements across the whole political spectrum, all aimed at the elites they feel have left them behind.
So what's the final thought we should leave our listener with today, building on this idea of global convergence?
Okay. So we've established that the rapid growth of places like China and India has lifted millions out of poverty. It's created this massive rising global middle class.
And this new class has growing political power and rising expectations for their futures.
Just like the post-war middle class in the West did. However, what if political and economic inequality persists or even gets worse within those rapidly growing nations? that internal tension won't stay domestic for long. How will the domestic struggles in these rising powers reshape global solidarity, international trade, and global stability? Their internal fight for a fairer share might just define geopolitics for the next 50 years.
That is a complex and vital challenge to think about.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.